Hello, and welcome to the official podcast of the Toronto Metropolitan University's Children's Media Lab. In today's episode, we bring to you a recording of the Middle Schoolers and Screens Reimagining the Positive Potential of Media for 12 to 14-year-olds webinar, an event that was run by the Children's Media Lab and the Media Innovation Research Lab on March 14th, 2024. This project was graciously funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC. Everyone, welcome to our webinar, Middle Schoolers and Screens, Reimagining the Positive Potential of Media for 12 to 14-year-olds. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Josanne Buchanan, and I am a children's media, technology, and digital wellness researcher, an educator. And for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, the Children's Media Lab is an organization, a research organization, headquartered at Toronto Metropolitan University in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And our mission is to bridge the gap between academic research and content creation, and to positively impact media creation and content for children and youth by hosting these innovative think tank events, webinars like the one you're attending today, and doing a whole bunch of other media literacy and children's media research projects in industry and academia. This event is special because it's a collaboration between our lab, the Children's Media Lab, and the Media Innovation Research Lab. And it's part of a research project that is led by Charles Davis, who's joining us today. He's the leader of this project, and it's also funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, or SSHRC, if you're in Canada. So thank you so much for joining us today. We kindly ask for all attendees to have their mics and cameras off during the session, unless you're one of our panelists. If you have questions, please write them down if you have a notepad, if you have a notes document open on your computer. And in the last 15 minutes of this session, you will have an opportunity to add them to our chat, okay? So it'll be very exciting, and we look forward to having you do that. Before we move forward, I want to pause for a land acknowledgement to the original caretakers of the land on which we share this session, which is Toronto, and to all of those who were here before us, to the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Chippewa, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, from which this name Toronto comes from, which translates to where the trees meet the water. In Treaty 13, in the dish with one spoon territory. We give this land acknowledgement in respect of the Indigenous people's principal kinship to the land, and encourage you wherever you are in the world to acknowledge the land that you are coming from as well. So we just like to give a moment to acknowledge that. Okay, so we organized today's gathering in response to the immense digital pressures and potentials that today's middle schoolers, that is kids aged 12 to 14, are facing today. There's just so much happening. There's access to interactive media, immersive digital spaces like Roblox and Minecraft, social media, and there are enormous content libraries that today's early teens have access to, like Netflix and Disney+. And before the age of 13, which is the age of requirement for most social media platforms, children are using sites like Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook, while still also being avid viewers of things like television. And when children in some countries turn 12, it's a really pivotal moment for them, because what happens is they enter middle school. That's what it's called in Canada. It might be different around the world. And with that, at the age of 13, children are able to sign up for social media for the very first time. Middle school has new social and academic pressures. And as youth navigate the complexities of this developmental period, they begin to seek and rely on sources outside of their families. It goes from being mom and dad advising them to being someone like a Mr. Beast or influencers or even friends at school. And so media is so very important. And we designed this session so that we could provide a positive psychology perspective about media, focusing not on harm prevention, which very rightfully is the focus of a lot of research, but now focusing on how we can use research and how youth can use research to thrive and to flourish. So we're so excited to talk about this today, and we hope to provide you with a few things. Number one, a deeper understanding of the positive opportunities and effects that middle schoolers can derive from digital media. Number two, knowledge of what we need for all youth to thrive in the digital age, no matter what part of the world they come from. And number three, with our panelists today, we hope to cultivate some actionable steps that we can all take, whether we're working as librarians, mentors, media literacy experts, students. What can we do to empower the middle schoolers in our lives and in our communities? Okay, want to introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. Laura D'Olimpio. She is the Associate Professor of Philosophy of Education at the University of Birmingham in United Kingdom, and she's the editor of the Open Access Journal of Philosophy in Schools. Her first book, Media and Moral Education, A Philosophy of Critical Engagement by Routledge, won the 2018 Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia's annual book prize. And she recently published a public philosophy book called Shortcuts Philosophy. She has a new book coming out in May, which is called The Necessity of Aesthetic Education, the Place for the Arts on the Curriculum. And we will be sharing the link to pre-order that book at the end of this webinar session. So look out for that. We're so grateful to have you here. We have Matthew Johnson, the Director of Education for MediaSmarts, which is Canada's Centre for all things media literacy. He's the author of many MediaSmarts parents, youth, and classroom resources, including Break the Fake. And that was such a great campaign. It brought back the famous House Hippo, if you're a 90s kid and you were watching that on your screen in Canada. And he's also consulted on numerous books and TV series on digital media literacy, including Wacky Media Songs, which airs in Australia and Canada. Dr. Ali Reza Bastani is the founder and CEO of the Association of Iran Media Literacy, which is an Iran-based organization that aims to improve population-wide media literacy with a focus on youth. It is actually the first non-governmental organization in Iran to focus on media literacy, and he is also a passionate educator and speaker on critical thinking and media literacy. And we have Dr. Heather Mellon, PhD. She is a leading researcher and consultant in youth purpose development and education, whose career in developmental psychology and education spans over 20 years. As the Senior Director of Research for the Stanford University Center of Adolescents, she has studied diverse aspects of youth purpose development, civic engagement, and young entrepreneurs for young adults, and artistic development. And she's the author of Teaching for Purpose, Preparing Students for Lives of Meaning. And we're going to share a link to one of her key resources for purpose learning at the end of this webinar. And then finally, we have Dr. Linda Sharmaraman, who is the founder and director of the Youth Media and Wellbeing Research Lab and the senior research scientist at Wellesley Centers for Women at Wellesley College in Massachusetts. Her longitudinal National Institutes of Health research focuses on the risk and resilience faced by middle school adolescents who are using social technologies. There's a great workshop her lab is running. It's free for all middle school girls around the world. It's a digital wellness workshop. We're going to share the link in the chat throughout our webinar. So just a moment of gratitude for our panelists. If we were in person, we'd be clapping, but just acknowledge these are the people who are really turning the tide when it comes to youth digital wellness. So we're so happy you're here. Okay. All right, so let's hop into some questions. I know that there have been many topics on the minds of our attendees, and we're so happy to condense those into questions today that we're asking you. So my first question, I just want to go around the room and get a sense of what media literacy for youth is like in each of your regions. How are youth using and engaging with media literacy? So my question is, we know that there are a lot of media literacy curricula around the world. And how is media literacy a positive part of middle schoolers' lives in your region? And I will start with Dr. Laura D'Olimpio.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. As a philosopher, I don't have as much of a fine-tuned touch on some of the policy and sort of empirical data to answer this question from that perspective, even though I am interested in some of the empirical and policy information from, in this case, UK, and previously I worked in Australia. But my focus has been very much on how using philosophy as pedagogies to ways to get young people to engage in critical and compassionate thinking and dialogue can help them to engage with some of the key messages and even stereotypes that are pervasive in society. So, in terms of answering it from that perspective, there's not widespread use of philosophy in schools, even though there are quite a few passionate advocates for it. But I feel that this is a tool and a technique that can go very well hand in hand with media literacy, but also with the arts and the humanities and other subject areas as well. So, in terms of what's being done well. I might not be able to answer that exactly in terms of media literacy, but I do think it's one of the areas where, in some ways, policy almost runs ahead of the research because in philosophy, in my area, it's one of the things that we've been just a little bit slow to really take up seriously. I think that's starting to change, but the benefit of an interdisciplinary panel like this, it to me is just so needed and evident because I think we do need to bring those expertise together to then hopefully inform not just best practice, but also good policy. So thank you.
Wonderful answer. Yeah, we'll be hearing a lot about the moral benefits of engaging with art from Dr. Laura Olympio. Thank you so much. Dr. Linda Sharmarman, I'd love to hear from you. So what is media literacy education like for middle schoolers in your region? How are they engaging with it? How is it a positive part of their lives?
Sure. There's actually been some national organizations on media literacy that have been, functioning, for over a decade now, and it's been able to trickle down into some of the school districts. Unfortunately, there's a lot of unevenness across the different states of the United States on how much the government, kind of encourages, the curricula, how much when it's mandated or not. And there's different aspects of media literacy that people kind of adopt that they think is relevant to their students, and others are kind of left on the side for another day for college, perhaps. So we're talking about media literacy in terms of there's the mainstream media literacy, there's news information literacy, there's computer science skills, there's the health and wellness part of literacy. And then there's the newer things like digital citizenship and social media literacy. And I think some of the things that are going well is that people, I think school districts and principals are feeling more convinced, especially post-pandemic, when everybody was kind of on their screens so much. There's a greater awareness of the importance and the essential aspects of media literacy in our lives, for our students' lives and in our educators' lives and parents' lives. And so I think the interest is there. It's just hard to know how to implement it across, even within one school district, let alone like a whole state or a whole nation.
Yeah, it's hard when you have so many regions that are trying to get on the same page, for sure. I'd love to hear from Dr. Heather Mallon now. What's media literacy like in your region for middle schoolers?
Yeah. So similar to Laura, I'm not on the ground or really involved with media literacy education, but I do know, kind of similar to what Linda was talking about, that California has somewhat recently enacted legislation that does mandate that schools provide media literacy and provides resources. If you go to the California DOE website, they've started to collect resources that schools can access. That said, similar to what Linda said, it's really up to the schools and the districts whether and how that gets implemented. And California is an enormous state with a huge population, and so that's really going to vary quite a lot. I will also say that preparing for this question, I asked my resident 15-year-old if, does her school teach media literacy? And she didn't miss a beat. She said, yes, of course, it's called English. It's just a matter of whether the students pay attention and participate and engage in that learning. So somewhere along the way, at least she got the message. They're getting the message that you're doing critical thinking in your classes, content area classes, and you can apply that to your use of digital media. But I'm not sure how widespread that explicit information is being, provided. So.
Yeah, great answer from your daughter. Because English is all about critical thinking and analyses. Wonderful. So I want to move on to our next question. Based on the work you've done with early adolescents, whether it's research, mentorship, doing things like committees and focus groups, what do early adolescents, so this is 12 to 14-year-olds, what do they need in order to thrive in the digital age? And I want to start with Matthew Johnson, if you have any insights there.
Thanks. I think what they really need at that age is a lot of support in dealing with the social and emotional pressures that come with social media primarily. Because we know that that is the age where most of them start using it. It's often the age where they get their first phone based on our own research. And we know that both of those things happen in many cases actually at the instigation of parents. So we found with phones, for instance, 2/3 of the youth in our study said that they had got their first phone not because they asked for it, but because their parents gave it to them to be able to keep in touch with them. And similarly, when we looked at how many students or young people who were under 13 had accounts on different social networks, we found that one of the top ones was Facebook. And I can tell you, kids aren't on Facebook, aside from Facebook Messenger. We asked about that separately. They're not on Facebook to hang out with one another. They're on Facebook to stay in touch with their parents. And so they're getting from very early on, unfortunately, a sense that they need to be connected. They need to be on call all the time. And we know that this becomes a tremendous pressure. It has a lot to do with why they want to have their phones in their bedrooms as they get older, because they feel the need to be available to their friends. It comes from a very good place of wanting to be able to support their friends, but obviously it's bad for our mental wellness to be on call all the time. They need support in dealing with the ways that the designs of these social networks and other platforms, particularly social networks, can lead them to unhealthy habits, to, for instance, comparing themselves to other people, to expecting themselves to look perfect. And we also see, and this I found really interesting, kind of a crash in terms of the use of digital devices to make media. That we actually found this was highest at the younger ages, and that the older, once they get into the proper teen years, they're least likely to be using digital devices to make media. So we're not really sure what happens exactly, but we know that there's something that happens that means that as they get older, they feel either less comfortable or, for whatever reason, less able to be creative with these tools.
Very interesting. When we think about young kids, I mean, for me, I don't think about Facebook. I think about TikTok and Instagram. So that's pretty cool. Dr. Ali Reza Bastani, I'd love to hear from you. What, according to your research, because you've done a lot in Iran with media literacy, what are some of the things that early adolescents need in order to thrive in the digital age?
Thank you. Let me tell you that my team and I are not so optimistic regarding to the media literacy education in all countries, because we believe that when we are talking about the literacy includes up to different words. The first is the skills, teaching students with the skills, and the second one, teaching them with the knowledge. But we are talking about the media literacy while there is not a clear definition regarding to the media literacy in itself. This is very important. There are lots of varieties of the definition regarding to the media literacy. We believe that every country or all communities are making some curriculum or some schedule or some lessons in the media literacy education for the children, upon their interest of some definite subjects. And that's why we believe that the media literacy education does not work at all, because we are not getting a very tangible result out of the education of media literacy to our children. There are lots of discussions that I hope we can get a very good conclusion out of today's meeting.
Thank you for that. It's so true. And one of the things we're focused on for today is solidifying and clarifying what we mean by media literacy, because you're right, Dr. Bastani, it's hard to place. There's so many variations. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, so moving on, I want to talk about how media can support youth well-being. Research tells us that middle schoolers have unique needs and desires from media. They don't like to be talked down to. They don't like to think that they're watching something that is very instructive and educational and didactic, but they are looking for guidance on things like how to help their friends with mental health challenges, how to deal with relationships, and increasingly how to deal with mental health challenges and finding purpose. A lot of youth are thinking about whether they want to go to college, university, entrepreneurship. There's so much on the table for early adolescence. So my first question, and I would like to direct this, I think I want to direct this to Matthew Johnson first. What are some challenges and barriers faced by individuals who are trying to design media to meet the needs of middle schoolers? So actually, I want to take a step back. So two-part question. Number one, what do middle schoolers want and need from media in order to support their well-being? And then number two, what are some design challenges that creators and media literacy educators and librarians and such face when trying to meet those needs?
Well, we definitely know that young people in general, and particularly at this age group, are looking for authentic representation that reflects the worlds they live in and their own lives. And of course, representation does relate to things like representation of gender and diversity, but it also does relate to how they perceive their own lives. At this age, they're certainly much more conscious of their own identities than younger kids. They're much more sensitive to things that that feel inauthentic to them. And that, of course, is a real challenge for anyone who's delivering content. It is one of our biggest challenges to make sure that what we're delivering is authentic, because it's from a practical, from a logistical and a cost perspective, it's hard to have young people as involved in the development of resources or programming as we would like. And I think that a lot of people who deliver content, whether it is educators or librarians or whether it's people producing media, have similar issues, similar challenges. But it really is essential to make sure that young people's voices are being heard. And at the same time, the flip side of that is that we know that when we actually do research with young people, we often find that as much as they are the experts on their own personal experience, they don't necessarily have that accurate a sense of what youth their age in general are going through. So they routinely, for instance, overestimate how common things like cyberbullying or sexting are, and they underestimate civic engagement. They underestimate how many people feel that it's important to push back against things like hate and prejudice online. That was one of the real things that we found in our research, was that a strong majority of young people do feel it's important to push back against those kinds of things, but they're not aware that everyone else feels the same way. And so it is getting, that is kind of the dual challenge, is it on the one hand, reflecting their authentic experience, but also correcting those misconceptions, confronting that pluralistic ignorance, which relates to so many things. I mean, it relates to body image and it relates to pornography, and helping people understand that they're not the only ones when it comes to levels of media literacy, for instance, but also that a lot of the challenges, a lot of the negative behaviors they may be conscious of are less common. And that is a challenge in itself, because you want to sensitize them to these things, but you have to be very careful that if you are doing programming, whether it's media programming or educational programming, you have to be very careful that in sensitizing them to these things, you don't make them seem more common than they really are, because we know at this age they are tremendously vulnerable to what they think is the social norm around an issue. And we know from well-established research with offline bullying that if kids this age think it is common, they are more likely to engage in it and less likely to intervene when they witness it. And that the reverse is true. When they get accurate data, which is almost always lower than they believe, they are less likely to engage in it and they're more likely to intervene.
That's amazing. Because you see so many youth, especially on online forums, talking about some of the issues they face. And in those small settings, it seems like so many of them are experiencing things like cyberbullying and maybe not being as politically literate. But it's interesting to think that some of these things might be underestimates. And you're just seeing communities with a lot of people who share those traits, but it's not reflective of other youth. That's really interesting. Thanks for sharing that. So Matthew Johnson was mentioning that youth are really sensitive. We have to be careful about what we show on screens because it influences what they think is the norm. And speaking of norms, I want to talk about morals. So Dr. Laura D'Olimpio, you've done some work. You wrote one article. It was called Moral Education for Digital Natives. And in that article, you mentioned that in order to navigate digital settings, youth need much more than just critical thinking. They also need to know about morals. They need to understand what compassion is, how to be civil online, how to be a good digital citizen. So I want to ask you, what are some of those soft skills, as we call them, or those character traits that youth need to effectively navigate the digital age? And how can media be a moral resource for teaching some of those things?
Thanks, Joseanne. Yeah, I'm really interested in this combination of individual skills, which might be supported by, it might be policy or legislation, or, how we use these things in these sources in educational spaces. And so with the individual skills, I think there's a whole lot of work for the critical thinking skills, for sure. And then I think that this needs to be supported, as you said, by some notions of moral skills or virtues. It depends what kind of language you like to use. And I wrote in particular about compassion, because I think one of the things that we very easily forget when we're mediated via screens is that the other person, who we may or may not know, perhaps can see or only are engaging with an avatar, that they're a real life person, much like ourselves, with thoughts and feelings and their experience. And to find a way to remember that, what we say and how we're engaging with them, that they might be affected by that emotionally and psychologically, as well as intellectually. And one of the ways I think that we can use media is, as you're already, a few of our panelists were saying, young people are already engaged so much, and they do have their favorite games or their favorite TV shows, these kinds of things. And so I'm interested in trying to find a space in the classroom to encourage a dialogue that engages with those, those narratives that or games that they're playing with. Because I think that you've already got the interest, and they might already be having these conversations. And if we can find a way to support and bring that conversation into a more safe, protected space like a classroom, then we can encourage that, deeper dive into the different questions that they've got, their perspectives. But in my mind, the way that the philosophical thinking skills help with this and the pedagogies that I want to advocate for, it's very much student focused and student led. It's not the teacher who has all the right answers, particularly given that technology moves so much faster than I think a lot of us do. But it is student focused and student led as well. So it's not to deny that the teacher has really important resources at their disposal, but to allow space for children's own voices and questions to come up. And so I think, Matthew mentioned how we're trying to find ways to do that with the media and the content itself and online as well. I think it's important to also try and do that as much as we can in the classroom. And again, this will probably depend on knowing your group, knowing your class, and what kind of issues are present in that group, so that it's not just a free for all. It's not just, say whatever you like. It is, you're still looking after those individuals, but it might be a way to engage in sensitive topics in a way that's showing that dialogue can continue on, rather than as soon as someone has a different point of view to you, you're no longer friends with them or the conversation stops. And I know that that's a tightrope. It's a tightrope to walk. It's really tricky. But I think that it's the skills we most need. So that's some of my thinking around that.
Excellent. Yeah. Because having the ability to be culturally receptive, empathetic, take in different viewpoints without canceling your friends, very important. So it's very relevant as well. Thank you. I want to talk about how media fits into the lives of today's middle schoolers. So we know what they want and need. What are they actually getting out of media? And so to start off that conversation, my question is, how does media fit into the lives of today's middle schoolers? Specifically, what are the key benefits they're getting from media? And this could be educational media, entertainment, so films and series, interactive, so video games and social media. And for that conversation, I'd love to get your perspective, Dr. Linda Sharmaraman.
Sorry, I just unmuted. Yeah, so there's so many different potential benefits that media use can have in the lives of middle schoolers, from like watching shows that portray characters that reflect their lives, their household composition, their stage in life, their developmental, tasks that they're trying to, build on, and learning about social skills through, identifying with other characters, whether it's on Netflix or on, a game that they're playing with other people on Discord or on YouTube. There's a lot of different areas in which you can get some positive role modeling, not just the negative. All the news is about the negative role models and all the outlandish things, all the viral things that are gone, that are very negative slanted. But there's a lot of mundane things that happen, everyday life kind of things, that forms the majority of people's experiences on media. Usually it's not like mind-blowingly, positive and transformative, and it's not usually like, traumatizing. It's usually somewhere in between, like, oh, it could be educational, it could be, you can do watch YouTube videos for do-it-yourself, kind of projects, and you can watch, National Geographic and learn about the world, and you can create, campaigns for civic engagement, through the use of social media, and the whole point of social media was to be social and to connect with other people that you normally couldn't in a geographic restriction, in everyday life. And so the power of the internet, could be used, for that. In our surveys that we've been asking our middle schoolers since 2019, before the pandemic, we asked them, okay, if you could do anything with social media and get guidance about social media, what would you want from adults in your life or from apps or websites? And it used to be that they wanted to know more about how to stay off their phones. And they would get those messages of, oh, parents are telling you, get off the phone, and this is not something that is a useful use of your time. But nowadays, it's very much, the number one thing they always ask is, how could I make the world a better place? They're using social media. And number two is always, inexplicably, I'm not really sure why, they want to know more about how to increase their self-esteem. And then the third is, how do I be more socially supportive to other people on social media? And very low on the list is more like, oh, how do I avoid cyberbullying? It's actually pretty low now. It's more like, how do I use this space to thrive, like you were asking before. And I think that's something interesting for programmers and educators to kind of see that there's an openness to that they want that kind of instruction, and maybe these tools that we have at our disposal could be helpful for that.
Thank you for that. That's so interesting. Do you think, just as a follow-up, do you think that there is a lower incidence of cyberbullying happening, and that's why youth are not seeking out help for cyberbullying, or do you think it's something else?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. First of all, it's the definition of cyberbullying varies from research study to research study. Some of them are very serious forms of cyberbullying that has to do with physical harm, and other ones are more on the other end, the mild teasing and kind of the usual stuff that tweens might do to each other, kind of like burn each other and do jokes and that kind of thing. And so it really depends on the user's vulnerability to feel like their self-worth is contingent on people saying things like that to them. So sometimes it's about an individual characteristic. I don't have the stats in front of me about overall cyberbullying, but I do know that in my studies of LGBT youth, cyberbullying incidents, at least in my area of the country, has gotten more and more aligned with the heteronormative, like the people who are not LGBTQ, they have the same rates as people who are not LGBTQ. So I don't know if that's a societal trend of more acceptance towards LGBTQ. Now it's just like, oh, if you're middle school, it's gonna, there's some mean things that might happen to you. Middle school, maybe it's not about your social group in that particular instance. That's just some emerging findings. We'd have to see how it is nationwide and elsewhere too.
Thank you so much. By the way, for anyone who is eager to read that research, we will be linking to Dr. Sharmaraman's lab page, so be sure to check that out when we share it. My next question is for Dr. Heather Mallon. So you wrote Teaching for Purpose, Preparing Students for Lives of Meaning, which is such a great read. We know that there are so many benefits to having purpose in your life, including increased self-efficacy, mental health, self-esteem. You take more meaningful risks, which is so important in adolescence when you're growing into the person you're going to become. You speak about some of the factors that lead to thriving for adolescents, including having community around you, engaging in arts expression. And so I'm curious to know, what are some ways in which you've seen or heard of youth using media to activate some of those factors for thriving in their own lives?
Yeah, well, there's the whole gamut. And so I'll go from when we started doing our research on youth civic development, which was almost 10 years ago now. We did actually, and then I'll go forward to where we're kind of heading now. Back then, when we actually asked, I think they were older teenagers, but we asked, like, what are some different ways that you get civically engaged? And we asked specifically about digital media and social media, and there was really it was not happening very much. It wasn't really, we couldn't find a lot of kids talking about that intersection of their kind of engagement in potentially purposeful activity or socially responsible or socially proactive activity using digital media. There was some in the expressive arts media, a little bit, but that wasn't necessarily digital. It could be people were making t-shirts that they could sell because they had a message or a cause they wanted to support, right? So it kind of spanned. Moving forward, I mean, I think, that's shifted, of course. And I think what's really interesting is where we're headed now. I'm actually, in a lot of the things we're talking about, I'm a big believer in the role of adults, especially with kids in the age we're talking about, in terms of scaffolding and being very conscious of the experiences that we're giving kids access to. Matt, you talked about the drop off of creative activity, and this is somewhat related because it's about what kids proactively contribute, produce, create using media. And I was not at all surprised to hear about this drop off in early middle school. I think it has a lot to do with the self-esteem. 12-year-olds are there's nothing I think that we can do to make 12-year-olds less vulnerable to criticism. They're going to be vulnerable to criticism. And so if they're putting themselves out there, that's going to be really hard. And it's going to, for a lot of kids, going to end their willingness to use digital media and social media spaces to be creative and put themselves out there. So I think we have a big role to play as adults. And so one of the things I'm excited about now, and especially in terms of purpose development specifically, is looking at how apps can be used to, and digital media and social media can be used to provide that scaffolding, especially now in the era of AI, and what everybody's excited about what AI can do. And how can AI provide the content exposure and all the information that kids need if they get an idea, or they want to like go out and change the world or have a positive impact or a supportive friend. And AI can provide them the content to do that, and they're going to figure that out. My interest is in always centering the question, how do we make sure AI in this particular usage improves human relationships rather than deteriorating human relationships? And so I'm actually heartened to see that I'm not the only one thinking that, of course. And so I'm working, for example, with an organization that's creating an app that does use AI coaching to help young people. They get an idea, they want to set their goals, they want to figure out their values, but it integrates human coaching with AI coaching. And so they're making sure that both of those resources are available, and the goal is to try to figure out when is going to be best, when will it be best for them to have access to the human mentor, and when can the AI step in and kind of fill out their content. And so this is all very, I think, really important, again, going to the role that adults play and scaffolding these experiences and making sure that we still are being aware and understanding how kids are engaging and how it's actually promoting what we want, which is better human connection, better social, engagement and skills, and identity development that is supportive rather than tearing them down. So that's kind of where I'm excited about the role that the potentially positive role that digital media can play, but it's always about keeping human and human adults in particular deeply involved.
Excellent, thanks. And we're actually going to share the Teaching for Purpose article that you wrote in the chat. So everyone look out for that. Now I'm going to move into my next question. So we're moving beyond just scripted media. Now we're going to talk about interactive media. We know in our research, there were so many things that kids mentioned, or middle schoolers mentioned, as influencing their character strength development. It's not just about the shows they watch. Superhero movies came up a lot, but it's not just about that. It's also about people who are displaying generosity online, like Mr. Beast, and teamwork through video game streams on Twitch. There's so many different ways to learn and to develop and flourish. So one thing I'd like to ask you, which actually is inspired by a question from one of our attendees, is when we're thinking about research findings with middle schoolers in VR and multiplayer game worlds like Roblox and Fortnite, what are we seeing there in terms of how those can influence well-being? And I will go to Matthew Johnson first, and then I will talk to Dr. Ali Reza Bastani. So go ahead, Matt. I'd love to hear from you.
It really does seem like VR in many cases has the same impacts on well-being as a lot of other interactive media. There are some significant differences when it is used consciously. So there does seem to be a lot of promise in the use of VR. In some cases actually as therapy, but also in some cases simply with wellness in mind, to promote more positive body image, to promote self-esteem, and even to help people deal with stress and things like that. Because it is more immersive, it can be a more effective way of relieving stress. There's even been some research done into using it as pain relief for people with burns, for instance. Obviously, all of those are likely to be kind of niche uses, given the way technology and media develop. More likely, the majority of uses of VR are going to be more commercial ones, similar to commercial video games. And so I think we are going to see more development of that kind. And there is evidence that things like harassment can be more difficult. That is to say, they can be more painful. The impact can be worse in VR for the exact same reasons, because there is more of a sense of transport, more of a sense that you are there, and less of a barrier. There isn't a screen barrier in the same way. And so it is harder to distance yourself from what's going on. And again, that can have positive benefits when it is being designed carefully, when it is being designed mindfully. But if moderation isn't built in, if safety isn't built in, if tools to limit and deal with harassment aren't built in, then all of those things can be worse than they are in traditional games or in social media.
Excellent, thank you. So Dr. Ali Reza Bastani, same question to you.
Yes, it is so interesting to me when I compare the different discussions in media literacy in different communities and comparing it with my own country. Let me give you a clear image of the media literacy education in Iran, because I am teaching the media literacy at this target group age in Iran. That is totally different. When you were talking about the cyberbullying, I've got to tell you that it is not a concern of the parents and the children in my country, because there is a digital police in Iran who is paying attention to any type of the cyberbullying. And so I've got to tell you that there is not such a problem of cyberbullying in my country. But teaching to all my students at the age of 12 to 14, and let me tell you that there is, there are many books which are officially educated to all students. The main important one is the media literacy and contemplation, right? This is one of the official books being taught in Iran. But the only concern of my students in all classes that I am teaching is they are so many times raising their own questions that what the actual terminologies that we are using in our daily discussions in the community of Iran mean. I am exactly referring to some definite words like democracy, like justice, like peace, and the equality. And that's why I'm telling you that it is so interesting to me when I hear something from the concerns of the parents' concerns and the students' concern in different communities, and comparing them with my own people and students. But we as the media literacy educators, we are unable to explain the exact meaning of these terms. You know that Iran is one of the political and ideological countries in the world, and it is it is true that my people and my students are exposed all the time with all these terms, because everyone is hearing lots of these words, on news, on the newspapers, in social media or whatever. But we as the educators, we are not able to transfer and to educate them with the exact meaning, because the democracy, my students would like to know the exact meaning of the democracy, but it is impossible because the democracy is not a clear word. When they are asking me about the justice, okay, it is not again clear, because justice goes back to the economy of the communities and to the politics or whatever, okay, in this regard. Or asking about their question about the peace. All the time when they are asking me the question of peace and international peace, I tell them that I refer all my students to the statement of the one of the international peace let's say theologians whose name is Johan Galtung, who is a Norwegian researcher in field of peace. But he says that the word of peace comes, or the position of peace comes when there is no conflict at all. My students cannot understand this definition of peace, right? And this is the same case for democracy. This is but since we are talking about the media literacy education in different communities, this is the reason that at the very beginning I told you that we believe in Iran that the media literacy education does not work at all, because we are not getting the same results in all communities in the world. Right? Talking about the literacy goes back to the knowledge and skills. Which skills are we going to teach to our students at school? The first one should be the critical thinking. The second one is the human communications, right? And lots of other, skills. We are not able, in a political country like Iran, it is very artistic affair for the media literacy educators like me to teach to the students with some terms which are somehow forbidden, which are not allowed to talk about the, let's say, democracy, right? But we are doing a very big task in such countries, totalitarian countries or something, right? My colleagues and I believe that all these terms should be redefined in a very clear and simple definitions to all people, because our target group are the children by the age of 12 to 14, or only any high schoolers at this age, right? Is it possible? Actually, it is not. Because all the time, talking to the students, there are lots of questions in the student's mind coming out of the class and asking privately with the teachers like me. And, I've got to answer their questions privately, but it is not good. I believe that it is a very good platform since there are so many media literacy educators to discuss later on this main point and the main discussion that we have to review the media literacy education policy.
I agree with that. Thank you so much for your points. So I want to ask a question now. Some great comments have been posted in our chat. Thank you for that, Dr. Ali Reza Bastani. That was wonderful. So yeah, Dr. Lloyd Wimpio, it's so important to be thinking about blurry boundaries, and yeah, and policy can help with that, certainly. So I do want to also jump back to Dr. Linda Sharma. So Dr. Linda Sharma, you did some excellent research with the National Institutes of Health, where you examined over 1,000 middle schoolers and their parents to see how they're using social media. We're talking all about interactive media and how it impacts well-being. Do you think you could speak a bit about what your research found in terms of how youth are using interactive media like social media to support their social, physical, and mental well-being?
Sure. I mean, that's a lot of data to summarize, but some of the key aspects I would say is that the more that we see technology being integrated into their lives from day one of being born, it's a blurred boundary. And a lot of people are we're seeing in our data that when adults think of themselves as using technology in their own private space, they think of themselves as alone. I'm interacting with people on the internet, but I'm actually alone. But if you ask a young person nowadays in this generation, if they're in their bedroom, texting with their friends and gaming, they're more likely to say, I'm not alone, I'm with my friends, and maybe it has to do with the pandemic, and that's what everybody had to do. But that's something I wanted to mention, that that using media, whether it's, binge watching a show versus, being a viewer or a creator on social media or a gamer, there's opportunities for risk and resilience, and sometimes parents really would just want to know, when do I know when there's something that I need to do to intervene, and really there's no cutoff time, like maximum number of hours, or what's the earliest they should be on social media, how old should they be on their phone. It really depends on your child and your tween and your teen. For some people, being exposed to something on social media for 15 minutes could set off their anxiety. But for other people, they could be on internet for like 6-7 hours gaming and interacting and talking about homework and also playing a game on the side, and they don't have any negative, ramifications for them being able to do their everyday life, like, socializing with friends, being with family, uh, feeding themselves, doing okay in school, like these are the things that you need to see that if those things are being taken care of, getting enough sleep, however much media that they're consuming, or, is it really the biggest concern, if everything else is doing okay? That's something that I think sometimes can help relieve the anxiety of, oh, I'm a bad parent for letting them kind of be on YouTube while I'm cooking dinner. Are they doing something? They could be doing something productive and educational. It's not always a shame-based narrative that somehow technology is like being a bad parent, or that they're wasting their time. And sometimes wasting their time also is a coping strategy for if they're stressed out someplace else. They might be using, watching a show or scrolling on social media to temporarily relieve some of those feelings of stress or boredom even. Sometimes it's very boring, to they have it's at their fingertips. It's very accessible. And so those are just some thoughts I had from some of our research over time.
Thank you. We're going to head to the next questions. I just want to let everyone know we are coming up to the time where we'll be having the Q&A. That will start in about 6 minutes. So if you have questions for our panelists, and some of you have been doing this already, just drop them in the chat. Okay, we'd love to hear from you. So thank you, Dr. Sharmarman. And I know you were talking more about your research findings, but I also just wanted to tell everyone, because we're going to talk about what is the best way for content creators to include youth. What's the direct pathway from youth voice to content creation to make the digital landscape more conducive to well-being. There is an amazing workshop. It's free. It's a digital wellness workshop hosted by Dr. Sharmarman's lab and institution. We're going to be sharing that in the chat. If you know any young middle schoolers anywhere in the world who would like to join, please click on it, please investigate, and follow them on Instagram as well. So yeah, I want to talk about how we can invite youth voices into media discussions. And so, Dr. Laura D'Olimpio, I'd love to hear your insights. How can the film and entertainment industry, this body of media that can morally impact youth, become more receptive to their voices? What are some ways in which youth voices can be shared with them?
Well, my research has mostly focused on educational spaces. So that is obviously a space where already we've got the students in there, captive audience really. And it's about sort of getting them to sort of engage by talking about the media that they're using, which might be more associated with their private spaces or their out of school hours. And so one of the things that I focus on is switching the way the dialogue works so that the students' voices or children's voices do have a role to play and that they get to ask their own questions. Too often I see, even in really creative spaces, where it's the teacher who's come up with the question. And I think you can find a way to have a topic that you think is the one that you want them to explore, and they still have space to ask their own questions because you can pick the stimulus material or the theme, but get them to bring in, an example that they really like or a character that they enjoy, and to really ask their own question. And so I think that is really important so that students get used to the fact that they are allowed to ask those questions and encourage that criticality. And when I teach university students, I can see that there hasn't always been enough space for that, because by the time they get to university, where we're asking them to lead a seminar discussion, they're very quiet, they're very reluctant to speak up. And this is more so in certain cultures than others. There is that difference. And so I just think, we need to do that. And one way we can do that is by starting with the things that they're really passionate about, that they're interested in. It might be that we need to, find out ahead of time so that the teacher can go and find out, a little bit about Minecraft or, Fortnite or whatever it is. But then bring those examples as your jumping off point. And some of the work that, I've looked at in particular are film and television. And while I think that, we've been speaking about the positive shifts in terms of representation, there are still huge gaps. There's still a lack of the focus that I looked at in particular was gender representation for, female protagonists for characters. It's still the case that there are, fewer female protagonists. They speak less, they wear less clothes, they are less driving of the action. And when you look at behind the scenes, there are still far less female directors, writers, producers, content creators. And, even just looking at some of the stats from last year, and they're saying, in a year when Barbie dominated and gives this illusion that, the tide has changed, the actual percentage of, female directors and female-led mass art and film shows are still very much the minority. There's still much a global pressure of being young, slim, toned. There's these pressures of moral ideals. So beauty standards have become thought of as moral ideals. We're starting to identify with the image because we are surrounded by this selfie culture where we're always presenting ourselves in an image. And that cuts across diverse cultures, languages. It speaks instantaneously. And as soon as, you become old, saggy, obese, like all of these things, it's not just that you're being presented superficially in a certain way. People start to attribute negative moral traits to that. And this, I think, is a real worry. And so in terms of bringing it back to the classroom and back to what educators can do, and, again, in terms of media creation, hopefully increase genuine diversity and representation and not just have it be tokenistic. But we need to learn to name that and sort of say, we need to be inclusive. We need to be aware of this as a form of discrimination. We need to start to recognize it before we can say, actually, that doesn't feel so great. So I was looking at some of the work by Professor Heather Widdows, who says we should call out lookism as a new form of a discrimination. It's just as bad as racism or sexism. It's very common. It's great to hear that a lot of forms of bullying and cyberbullying are on the decrease, but the majority form is still that kind of lookism. And people feel this pressure to conform to these perfectionist standards, which they'll never attain. And labeling pictures as, filtered or doctored, there's some evidence to show that that doesn't make a difference. It doesn't make you feel better to know that it's completely fake. You still feel that pressure. You just internalize that sort of shame or that ambition. So I think we need to start talking about that a little bit more and, you know, finding, again, going back to my notion, not just of being critical, but being compassionate, finding ways to bring that about.
Thank you for sharing that. A lot of what you share resonates with my children's media lab team, and I'm sure a lot of our guests, especially in children's media, with the ways in which female characters are portrayed. You know, we found in our research, most of them are thin or underweight when compared to characters of other gender. There's a tendency to wear revealing clothing. For so long in marketing, there's been this focus on pink and lilac. I think that's changing a bit now. I visited the toy aisle recently, but still there are these boxes that we've been kind of trapped in. And for boys too, there's so much focus on becoming taller. I'm hearing that implants are becoming popular. I've seen on a few forums. Where boys are thinking of, you know, making their legs longer, trying to go for that muscular ideal. So it's so important to think of lookism and the impacts on our mental and physical health. Thank you so much for bringing that to our conversation. I want to talk about just briefly, and please, if you have any questions, put them in our chat. How can we bring youth voices into policy creation? So if there's one thing that brings us all together, it's we all have these positions as decision makers or researchers who have worked with policy in some capacity, or NGOs or local organizations. So what are ways in which we can bring youth voices into policy creation when it comes to digital wellness, digital responsibility? And for that, I want to start with Matthew Johnson.
That's a big part of why we do our research, so that we can hear youth voices and present them to people who can make a difference. It also gives us an opportunity because we're an educational organization, we're a registered charity. So there's a limit to how much we can advocate on policy ourselves. But we can communicate what young people have to say about policy. And so we have done a number of research projects. I mentioned one relating to online hate. Of course, we've been doing our Young Canadians in a Wireless World survey, which has had 4 phases since starting in 2001. But also we've done more focused work on things like how youth would like to give consent to data collection online, how they would like to be able to report misinformation online, and things like that, how they their feelings towards recommendation algorithms on sites like YouTube and TikTok. And the real value of that for us, besides obviously the data and how it informs our work, is that we can then take these and present them to regulators and policymakers and to the platforms themselves, so that we can say to YouTube and TikTok and whoever else, this is how young people would rather the consent regime works. This is how young people feel about recommendation algorithms. This is how they would like to be able to report misinformation when they see it. So it's really vital to have that line where young people's voices can be amplified and communicated to policymakers, to regulators, and of course to platforms themselves. And one of the things that we do as well in our educational material is we help young people understand that they have a lot of power as consumers. Because in fact, we all know, I think, here some of the challenges with legislation and regulation relating to media, and some of those challenges exist for very good reasons. Most of us live in countries with robust free expression traditions, so there are always going to be limits to what regulation and legislation can do. And in the cases where platforms have made major changes in how they do business, it has been very often because of consumer and advertiser pressure. And so it's a really important part of digital citizenship for us, is helping young people understand the power that they have as consumers and as audiences to the advertisers, who of course are where the revenue of these platforms and of broadcasters and increasingly streamers as well actually comes from.
Perfect. Thank you. And thanks for the work you're doing at MediaSmarts. So crucial to bring youth voices into those huge conversations. We have a really cool question relating to some of what Dr. D'Olimpio spoke about before, from Kai. She says, have you found that middle schoolers in these critical media literacy conversations, have they expressed any concerns or have they been impacted when the creators of projects do not have the lived experiences of the characters they're representing? So as an example, there's Barbie, who was created, and there were a lot of men behind her creation, influencing what she wore, her proportions. So this goes out to anyone who has worked with youth, maybe in a focus group capacity or research. Are they concerned about representation behind the screen in addition to on screen? How have they been impacted?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I don't know the answer in terms of specifics, so someone else on the panel might. But I mean, one of the things that I think we need to be mindful of is when we're talking about these digital natives who have a lot of skills, and we talk about them having skills that, you know, maybe we don't, and that they're teaching their grandparents how to use a smartphone. I still think we need to pause and remember it doesn't mean that they necessarily have all the skills and knowledge as to how to engage ethically and in a constructive way that's really going to help themselves and their friends with those media devices and the online, you know, platforms. And so there is still really important role. I think Heather also mentioned this for the adults and for bringing that knowledge to share with them in a way that, again, as you've said, doesn't talk down to them, but includes them in the conversation. But to say, you know, there are still ways that we need to protect them. And in my experience, the couple of younger people I spoke to who saw Barbie, they loved it. They weren't aware that it was created by men, for example. And obviously, a lot of the media portrayal has been about the female director and all of these kind of things. So I think that there is, you know, extra information there that could be brought to that conversation. And there's a way of starting off the conversation that's needed. So maybe someone else wants to weigh in on that.
I also want to just say that Natalie Coulter has shared the Young Canadians in a Wireless World report. It's a great report that talks about young people's attitudes and behaviors and opinions regarding the internet. So for anyone who's a content creator, who's exploring what's on the horizon for digital wellness, absolutely great resource. Please do look at it and bookmark it. Yeah, does anyone else want to contribute to that? How are youth responding to representation or lack thereof behind the screens? And if not, I'm going to take Craig Dale's question.
I just wanted to add to what Laura was saying, and in terms of the algorithm designers, the tech designers in that industry, they're often represented by mainly white males, like people in the majority represent, you know, and so it's a function of like the lack of a pipeline really for STEM, for female, you know, designers to get at those levels of board involvement and being policy at the tech design level, and also people of color being able to access those areas. And so if there could be more of a push for a pipeline for not such a high glass ceiling for people of marginalized backgrounds to be able to help institute algorithms that are safe and healthy for all kinds of identities, I think that would be a great opportunity in the future.
I want to add one little thing to what Laura was talking about, kind of feeling my way through here, but because it's not like something I have research on, but I do think that one thing to remember when we're asking questions like, how are young people in this age range understanding or experiencing information like this, is like what they're doing with it is they're taking what they see online in media, and this goes to also, I think what Ali, you were talking about, is then they're taking it and they're talking with each other, and so their ideas are spinning around in this space of these very ambiguous ideas, whether it's sexism in media or democracy and peace and justice, or, you know, these very difficult ideas. And they're kind of using the little bit of information they get from whatever sources they happen to be tapping into, and then they're kind of spinning. And so you can see, like, you know, for some, they can take it really far in a difficult direction, and for others have better capacity to kind of process what they're accessing. And so I don't know what that means for policy or education. To me, what it means for education is a lot of what Laura was talking about, which is, I think, I can't believe, like, why are we still talking about students not having opportunities for open-ended student-led discussion about the topics that they find challenging? Yeah, I think more capacity for that in the safe space of school is really important. So
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, that was excellent. Tying this creativity to the policy process as well. It's a link we don't make often, right? So thank you for that. So I want to take Craig's question. Is there any research on students who learn to construct media, like film, podcasting, and design, and their ability to navigate the media world? So Matthew, I want to pass that to you.
Sure. Well, there's kind of two answers to that. So the first is that when we look kind of at what you might call traditional media literacy, that is to say the ability to engage critically with media, learning how to make media is helpful, but it's not sufficient. There's a tradition in media literacy education called demystification, which is essentially the idea that once you learn how to make media, you'll be better able to critique it. And that there's definitely an element of that. There's definitely some truth there. But the thing is that there are a lot of pressures and influences on media, on the media that comes to us, on the mass media that we consume, that aren't part of just the media making process. So when you're making films in class, you don't have a studio head telling you that you have to hit 3 quadrants, and you don't have a budget, and you don't have, you're not aware of the industry conventional wisdom, which often is, has nothing to do with the actual data, but is just as powerful. And so it is, of course, really important to know how media are made. We do need to do that, if only because it's an essential part of developing the critical vocabulary that we need to critically engage with media. So we need both of those. We need that practical knowledge, what we call reading media skills, understanding the grammar and the vocabulary of different media, but you also need to understand the commercial and social side of it as well. Otherwise, it's an incomplete picture. But the other half of that question is that learning how to make media does empower youth to be civically engaged online. Because in many cases, when they can use media making, whether it's something as simple as making just a first person POV video, or making a podcast, or making more complex things, having that ability makes it so much easier for them to get involved, to get their message out, to share their experiences. Having those skills developed helps give them the confidence, and of course it helps them reach an audience that would have been impossible a generation ago.
Shall I add something to Dr. Johnson's? In Iran, we have provided all students at the high school level with some tutorials that are teaching them how to report some news. And actually, our policy is training the students with the citizen journalism. We think that it is a very, applicable, way of teaching the tangible media literacy education to our students. And we have got a very positive and, feasible reactions from our students once they have been producing some media production by themselves, which are so fantastic in their own production. And another point, if I may, I would like to inform you that my team and I in Iran, and especially at the Association of Iran Media Literacy, that is an NGO, we have made our policy to make a comprehensive and a standard curriculum in the media literacy, but it is in progress, and we hope that we can reach to this point as soon as possible in close future.
Thank you so much. So we're going to do a quick round the table discussion for this next question, which comes from one of our attendees, Natalie. Her question is about how media literacy might function as a way for tech corporations to absolve themselves of responsibility. What are some thoughts? Anyone can start, and then we'll just go around.
I'll start because that is something that's been raised often as an objection to media literacy education, and it is really important that those of us who are involved in media literacy education not allow it to be positioned as a substitute for appropriate regulation and legislation. It shouldn't just be about downloading responsibility onto the consumer, onto the public. At the same time, though, in order to have effective regulation and legislation, we need a media literate public. People need to understand these issues. And I think probably any one of us could name 3 or 4 pieces of regulation or legislation, either ones that were passed or ones that were proposed, that betray a very poor level of digital media literacy on the part of the people who framed them. And the discussion around these often betrays a lack of digital media literacy. So if we're going to have good regulation, if we're going to have legislation and regulation that actually makes a difference, then we need to have a populace who understands these issues. But in the end, I think of it as being like driving, where we do driver education and we have things that require the driver to do, like signaling, and we have functions that we require to be built in, but which the driver needs to use, like seatbelts. And then we have standards for the safety of these vehicles. And we always have to be on the lookout as citizens for the industry trying to water down those standards, trying to save money, trying to offload their responsibility onto the user. And it's exactly the same thing, I think, with media. We have to have both of those. We have to have the education. We have to have the standards of safety.
Absolutely. So thank you, Matthew. We're almost at the end. So Laura, do you have any thoughts? And then we're going to go around and you have 30 seconds just to provide some final thoughts. So we'll start with you, Laura. Any final thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with what Matthew said there. And I think one of the nice moves in education is this idea that, they're sort of aiming for a more holistic approach where we're trying to think of people as whole people who are going to go and lead these flourishing lives. I think that's quite a strong push in educational research. But at the same time, we shouldn't lay absolutely everything at the educator's door and expect them to solve every single problem, because that's asking too much of them. I think when we have some places where we've got a national curriculum, like in Australia, New Zealand, in the United Kingdom, we've got a little bit of a head start, except that, again, as you've already pointed out, some of the policies and the curriculum itself is already behind, and we need to try and get it to catch up. So there is a little bit of that toing and froing, and what individual teachers do in the classroom, from my perspective, no matter what subject area they're in, they do need to sort of grab whatever the students are really interested and engaged in already, bring that critical dialogue into the classroom space, learn a little bit about those things for themselves and encourage that reflection, so that we're asking, for me, it's about asking that moral question of, is this good? Is this helpful? How can we be compassionate here? And not just, is this useful? Is it fun? Is it going to make lots of money? So we need to bring that moral question back to the table.
Okay, final thoughts for anyone else before we wrap up?
I totally agree with so many of what my panelists have said today, and we do need a media literate public, but we also need media literate tech designers and media industry professionals that don't compromise at the capitalistic level. Like somehow they knew all these things and then it went out the door. Sometimes when you're trying to make a business, and I think a lot of people have said this in a roundabout way, but that does take a village to educate the youth for tomorrow's needs. It's the educators, the parents, tech industry, policymakers, all of us have our part in the equation, and hopefully we can all kind of keep moving forward with that ideal.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This has been a wonderful discussion. We have posted our panelists' contact information, social media in the chat. Please follow their amazing work. You can pre-order some of the materials they've been working on, like Dr. Laura D'Olimpia's book. As a next step, please do check your inbox soon for a summary of today's session. All of you will be getting that. We will post this to YouTube for anyone who wasn't able to make it. So if you're joining us from YouTube, thank you for tuning in. And stay tuned. We have our next event, Making Content That Positively Affects 12 to 14-year-olds. It's going to be an in-person event for Canadian youth and content creators. So we'll connect with all Canadian content creators soon about that. We have a design jam coming up for middle schoolers where they're going to create media with us. And then we're going to develop a strengths-based syllabus and teaching materials for middle school literacy programs. So a lot coming up. And I just want to close by saying, yeah, it takes a village to raise a child, and we need to consistently assemble these global villages of multidisciplinary experts in order to support digital wellness. So thank you for being a part of our village today, and we hope that we'll get together again really soon. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the official podcast of the Toronto Metropolitan University's Children's Media Lab. To stay up to date with the lab's latest events and projects, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Children's Media Lab and on LinkedIn by following the Children's Media Lab page.